Morgan Blake. Entry number 012. The Silent Town. A place without noise is often full of secrets. What if I told you that silence could be more than just the absence of sound? What if I told you that in some places, silence is a warning, a sign that something has gone terribly wrong? Stay with me until the end, and you'll understand why I had no choice but to believe in the impossible. It began with an anonymous tip, a message left on my voicemail that was nothing more than a few seconds of silence, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible hum. At first, I dismissed it as a prank, but something about the sound, or perhaps the lack of sound, gnawed at me. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. And that hum, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. It was as if something was hiding within that sound, something ancient and malevolent. Days passed, and the message lingered in my mind, intruding on my thoughts at the most unexpected times. I found myself playing it over and over again, trying to decipher the meaning behind it. The hum seemed to grow louder with each listen, reverberating in the depths of my consciousness. The more I heard it, the more uneasy I became. It was as if the sound was a living thing, burrowing into my mind, refusing to let go. Finally, I decided I had to trace the call. My curiosity had reached a breaking point, and I needed to know where it had come from. What I discovered led me to a small, out-of-the-way town named Stillwater, a name that seemed almost too fitting. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and life moves at a leisurely pace. Yet, as I neared the town, an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me, tightening my chest. The road leading into Stillwater was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to close in around me. Tall, ancient trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The deeper I drove into the woods, the darker it became, the light fading into a dim, eerie twilight that made it difficult to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen was tracking my progress. The hum in my mind had become a constant presence, a low, insistent buzz that seemed to sync with the beating of my heart. It grew louder as I approached the town, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white with tension. Finally, the trees parted, and Stillwater came into view. It was a small town, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering hills. The buildings were old, their weathered facades speaking of a time long past. There was a sense of decay about the place, as if it had been forgotten by the world, left to wither in isolation. The moment I crossed the town's threshold, I knew something was terribly wrong. There was no noise. No chatter from people on the sidewalks, no cars driving by, not even the sound of birds in the trees. The silence was absolute, as if the town had been plunged into a vacuum. Even the wind seemed to have lost its voice. I parked my car in the town square and stepped out. The crunch of gravel under my feet was the only sound I could hear, and even that was muffled, as if absorbed by the oppressive stillness. The buildings around the square were dark, their windows staring out like hollow eyes. There was no sign of life, no movement, no indication that anyone still lived here. As I walked through the deserted streets, the full weight of the silence pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. The town wasn't just quiet, it was completely silent. The few people I saw moved slowly, their expressions blank, their mouths opening and closing as if they were speaking, but no sound came out. I approached him, and sitting on a bench, his eyes glazed over as he stared into the distance. I tried to speak to him, to ask what had happened, but he didn't respond. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. I moved closer, waving my hand in front of his face, but there was no reaction. It was as if he was trapped in some kind of trance, locked in a world where sound no longer existed. The eerie hum from the voicemail echoed faintly in my mind, and I began to wonder if it was connected to what I was seeing. The silence, the strange behavior of the townspeople, something was feeding on this place, something that thrived in the absence of sound. I wandered through the town, the oppressive silence weighing on me like a physical force. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily deserted. Shop windows were dark, their displays gathering dust. A child's tricycle lay abandoned on the sidewalk, its wheels motionless. The few people I did encounter moved like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes devoid of life. As I walked, I noticed something peculiar, the architecture of the buildings, the layout of the streets. Everything seemed too orderly, too perfect, as if the town had been designed with some hidden purpose in mind. The buildings were all aligned with an almost mathematical precision, the streets forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the town itself was a puzzle, waiting to be solved. I found myself standing in front of an old, decrepit building at the edge of town. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the walls, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze that I couldn't hear. The hum was louder now, more insistent, pulling me toward the building like a magnet. The building itself was an enigma. It was larger than any other structure in Stillwater. The building itself was an enigma. It was larger than any other structure in Stillwater, its design a stark contrast to the quaint, traditional style of the rest of the town. The walls were made of heavy, weathered stone, and the roof was steeply pitched, giving it the appearance of an ancient cathedral. There were no signs, no indications of what the building had once been used for. It stood at the very edge of town, half hidden by overgrown trees and thick underbrush, as if it had been deliberately obscured from view. I hesitated at the threshold, a sense of foreboding washing over me. The hum was nearly deafening now, a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I could feel it in my bones, in the very core of my being, pulling me toward the darkness within. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushing it open with a creak that should have echoed through the stillness but was instead swallowed by the silence. The interior of the building was as decayed as the exterior. Dust covered every surface, thick and undisturbed, as if no one had set foot inside for decades. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling, hanging like tattered curtains, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the sound muted, as if the very structure of the building was absorbing every noise. But it was the silence that struck me the most. It was a silence unlike anything I had ever experienced before, complete, total, suffocating. It was as if the building itself had absorbed all sound, leaving nothing behind but the hum, which grew louder with every step I took. I moved deeper into the building, the walls closing in around me, the darkness growing thicker. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows swallowing the faint light that filtered in through the broken windows. The hum was overwhelming now, vibrating through my skull, making it hard to think. But I couldn't stop. I had to find out what was causing this, what had turned this once lively town into a silent graveyard. The hallway ended in a large, open chamber, its walls lined with strange, indecipherable symbols. The symbols were etched into the stone, their meaning lost to time. They glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with the hum that filled the air. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading to the center of the room. There, in the center of the chamber, stood the machine. The machine was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was massive, its form an intricate web of gears, levers, and tubes, all interconnected in a way that defied logic. The surface of the machine was covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the walls, the lines of energy running through them glowing with a cold, blue light. The hum emanated from deep within the machine, a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to resonate with the very core of my being. I approached the machine slowly, my footsteps silent on the dusty floor. The closer I got, the louder the hum became, until it was all I could hear, drowning out even the sound of my own thoughts. The machine seemed to pulse with energy, the light in the room dimming and brightening in time with the hum. On the machine's control panel, I saw a series of levers and buttons, each one glowing faintly in the dim light. My fingers hovered over them, unsure of what to do. I didn't know what this machine was or what it was capable of, but I knew that whatever it was the cause of the town's silence. I took a deep breath and pulled one of the levers. The hum stopped. For a moment, everything was still, the silence even more oppressive than before. And then, slowly, the sounds of the world began to creep back in. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of my own breathing. The relief was palpable, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But as the sound returned, so too did something else. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the light from the machine flickering as if struggling to stay lit. The air grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones, and I felt a presence in the room with me, something ancient, something malevolent. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the room. It was tall, its form obscured by the darkness, but I could see the faint outline of a figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed with a cold, blue light, the same light that pulsed through the machine. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure remained motionless, watching me with those cold, glowing eyes. And then, slowly, it began to move, gliding silently across the floor toward me. The air grew colder with each step it took, the shadows closing in around me, cutting off any escape. I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for the lever I had pulled moments before. But the figure was too fast. It was upon me in an instant, its cold, clammy hand gripping my arm with a strength that belied its ethereal form. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs as the cold seeped into my very bones, freezing me in place. The figure's eyes bored into mine, its silence suffocating, and I realized with a sickening jolt that the machine had not just silenced the town, it had awakened something far worse. The creature before me was not of this world. Its form seemed to shift and change with every passing second, a swirling mass of shadows and darkness. It was as if the very essence of the town's silence was embodied in this creature, a malevolent force that sought to consume everything in its path. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only silence, deep and all-consuming. The hum returned, louder than ever, drowning out everything else, and I realized with a sickening jolt that the machine had not just silenced the town, it had awakened something far worse. The figure stepped closer, its grip tightening on my arm, and I could feel the life being drained from me, the sound of my heartbeat growing fainter with each passing second. I struggled to pull away, but the figure was relentless, its eyes boring into mine, its silence suffocating. It was as if the very essence of the town's silence was embodied in this creature, a malevolent force that sought to consume everything in its path. Just when I thought I couldn't fight any longer, a flash of light filled the room, and the figure recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, as the figure dissolved into the shadows, the hum fading with it. The light seemed to burn away the darkness, banishing the creature to whatever hell it had come from. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the building as I fled. The town was still eerily quiet, but the hum was gone, and I could hear the faint, distant sounds of life returning. The people I passed were beginning to stir, their eyes blinking as if waking from a deep sleep. But I didn't stop to explain. I had to get out, had to put as much distance between myself and that building as possible. I never returned to Stillwater, and I've never heard of anyone else encountering the same silence. The town, as far as I know, remains just another dot on the map, forgotten by the world. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I can feel it, just at the edge of my hearing, that faint, insistent hum. It's a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, some of which are better left unsolved. In the months that followed my encounter with the silence, I tried to research the history of Stillwater, hoping to find some explanation for what I had experienced. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The town had been founded in the late 1800s by a group of settlers who believed they had found a place where they could live in peace, far from the chaos of the outside world. For decades, Stillwater thrived, its residents living simple, contented lives. But then, in the early 1900s, something changed. There were reports of strange occurrences, people hearing voices that weren't there, sounds that couldn't be explained, and, most disturbingly, periods of complete and utter silence that would descend on the town without warning. The silence, it seemed, had been a part of Stillwater for longer than anyone realized. It was a presence, a force that had always been there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. And when it did, it took the town with it. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the machine I had found was not of this world. It was ancient, older than the town itself, perhaps even older than humanity. A relic of a time when the boundaries between our world and whatever lay beyond were thinner, more permeable. The machine was a gateway, a conduit through which the silence could enter our world. I've encountered many strange things in my time, but nothing like that town. The silence was more than just the absence of sound, it was a living, breathing entity, feeding on the noise, consuming the life of those who entered its domain. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't gone, not really. It was still out there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. So if you ever find yourself in a place where the silence is too deep, too still, take it as a warning. Get out while you still can. Because some sounds, once silenced, can never be heard again. And if you ever hear it, that hum, that silence that shouldn't be there, don't ignore it. Turn back, run, and don't look back. Because once the silence finds you, it won't let you go. Morgan Blake. End of entry.